unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. As the fighting between Israel and Hamas intensifies, the world is bracing for the widening of a conflict that has the potential to escalate quickly and bring in outside powers from the region and beyond. The position India has taken in the aftermath of the horrific Hamas attacks on Israel on October 7th has been noteworthy. Unlike many countries in the global south, which offered qualified support for Israel after the attacks, India's initial response made no mention of Gaza at all, leaning into the country's newfound strategic embrace of Israel. To make sense of India's evolving position and the ways in which its Middle East policy has shifted over the decades, I'm joined on the show this week by the political scientist Nicolas Blarel. Nicolas is Associate Professor of International Relations at the Institute of Political Science at Leiden University in the Netherlands. He's the author of The Evolution of India's Israel Policy, Continuity, Change, and Compromise since 1922, and co-editor of the South Asia to Gulf Migration Governance Complex. Few scholars have examined India's relations with the Middle East in greater detail than Nicolas. I'm pleased to welcome him to the show for the very first time. Nicolas, thanks so much for taking the time.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
And I should just mention, I hope it's okay to say that you are the father of a newborn as of just a few days ago. So extra special thanks, congratulations, and thanks again for doing this on clearly on not very much sleep.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'll still be able to deliver some coherent thoughts over the next minutes.
Good.
Thank you.
So let's start with the Indian government's immediate response to the Hamas attacks on October 7th, because I think this got a lot of attention. Prime Minister Modi came out. He immediately issued a sharply worded condemnation of Hamas's, unprecedented attacks on Israeli civilians. He, a short while later, spoke with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, after which Modi reiterated, quote, India strongly and unequivocally condemns terrorism in all of its forms and manifestations, end quote. You had a piece which came out shortly after these events with Shumit Ganguly in Foreign Policy, and we'll link to that. And you pointed out, and others have said this as well, neither of Modi's initial statements acknowledged the state of affairs in Gaza. And of course, this contrasted with many different reactions that we saw from the global south. Did this surprise you at all?
Yes. Well, yes and no. I mean, a typical political scientist answer. Yes, in a sense, as you mentioned, it contrasted with a lot of positions, I think, from the global south, but also from past positions that India had. I mean, as Professor Ganguly and I argued in the piece, initially, as you mentioned, there was two initial tweets, which were the sole reaction and seemed to be unequivocally tilting towards the support of Israel without mentioning any context or talking about the initial reprisals against Gaza, the initial bombing of Gaza. So, and the fact that we had to wait for 5 days for a reaction from the Ministry of External Affairs spokesperson. To call, for respect for international law and reiterate India's position for a two-state solution. So did this come as a surprise, given, I think, India's more balanced reaction to previous Israel and Hamas or Israel-Gaza crisis? I mean, Shumit and I had written a piece, actually, in 2021, noticing how India's reaction at the time by the ambassador to the UN, and a very balanced reaction, criticizing Hamas actions, but also not noting the suffering of the Gaza population, especially in the escalation of violence at the time. So again, India very carefully balanced its position to try to be supportive to both civilian populations on both sides and try to call for de-escalation of violence. And as you know, India has regularly reaffirmed its support for the Palestinian cause, the Palestinian Authority, and especially also even under Narendra Modi's government, which some argued has tilted a little bit more towards Israel. But Modi has visited Ramallah, visited the Palestinian Authority. He was the only Indian prime minister to ever do this. He's voted, at least under his government, India has voted at UN General Assembly various times in support of Palestinian positions. And in November, recently in November 2020, I think India decided to quadruple its refugee assistance to the UN Release and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. So under Modi, India has regularly supported the Palestine. So this came as a surprise, this initial reaction. Now, that being said, the Modi government also has been much more public about its rapprochement with Israel. Modi has not just visited Ramallah, he's also visited a year earlier Tel Aviv, the first sitting Indian prime minister to do this. That was reciprocated to a few months later by a visit by Netanyahu. So there's also in New Delhi, there's also a close relationship, personal relationship between the two leaders. And Modi has been a long friend of Israel, traveling himself as chief minister to Israel in 2006. So this is not completely unexpected that this tilt would happen. But if we look at the past 9 years of the Modi government's positions, they usually has been carefully balanced.
So just to summarize, Nicolas, it sounds like what you're saying is, look, in a way, it is kind of surprising that Modi came out in the way that he did, because he had two quick back-to-back statements, neither of which mention Palestine or Gaza, just shoulder-to-shoulder support, extending shoulder-to-shoulder support with Israel. And that was noteworthy and perhaps reflective of a shift or a closer embrace, let's say, between India and Israel. But then 5 days later, MEA came out with a statement which was slightly more balanced. It reiterated India's longstanding commitment to a two-state solution. Do you think this was just kind of a restatement of policy? Do you think it was put out there to kind of modify or moderate India's original statements? How do you kind of parse the two coming back to back in the way that they did?
I think this was clearly a course correction. I think after 5 days, because the bombing in Gaza was happening, there was all these discussions already back then about operations and concerns starting to emerge from the global south about what would happen, about potential crimes of war. This was starting to emanate, and I think there was a position at the MEA that they needed to be a reiteration of the traditional principled position of supporting Palestine, the Palestine cause, and you mentioning the two-state solution. Mentioning the old UN Security Council resolution about the 1967 borders. This is coming back. Now, what is interesting, though, still in the shift part, it's there are two Modi tweets, and you have to wait for a spokesperson for the MEA, Amred Bakshi, to make the reiteration. It's not coming from the EAM. It's not coming from Dr. Jaishankar. It's not coming from Prime Minister Modi. So there is a shift. Usually, anytime there's a public statement after a crisis in the region, there is often an attempt to correct quickly within a few hours. This took 5 days, and it's happening in this fashion when it happened in a press conference when a question is asked to the spokesperson. So it's not even a deliberate attempt to publish an official statement on the website reiterating the position. So I think there is slightly a position. Maybe it's also because the situation is still fluid and they're still trying to figure out a position. That's also a possibility. But I think there was a clear intent in the first few days to have a strong backing of Israel, notably because of the scale of the terrorist attack, and because, and maybe we can discuss a bit further, this I think impression that terrorism is a more general global threat, and that India has been also targeted. And I think Jaishankar's statement today about we've been victims of terrorism, and that's why we act in certain solidarity with Israel. I think that is also something that came out. That is because this is a major state-sponsored terrorist attack. Hamas could be linked to Iran. And India has been targeted by groups that also were state-sponsored cross-border, and there could be some references to this similar threats, and so that's also a possible factor leading to the initial reaction.
I think it's worth pointing out that if you look at the flip side, what the opposition and the Congress Party said, their reaction to the events of October 7th was equally noteworthy, right? Because in the party's official statement, they said that they, quote, condemn brutal attacks on the people of Israel, but then they also extended support for the quote unquote legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people. And it was very interesting to see that many in India criticized the Congress for hedging. for not essentially doing what Modi did, which was initially to come in behind in full support. Do you think this is a sign that the ground has kind of shifted beneath the Congress on this issue? That in a sense there's a bit of a social churn, and the Congress is somewhat out of step with that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting development. I've been following, and the Congress even changed its position over time. Initially, it didn't. The Congress was initially criticized for not even condemning as explicitly Hamas and the attack. Initially, having a more pro-Palestine position and this can be explained. I mean, the Congress has held an historical position in support of Palestine, and you mentioned the title of my book in the introduction. I started in 1922 because that's the first statement made by the Indian National Congress, even before independence, on the Palestine question, on the question of the Palestine Mandate already at the time, criticizing the Balfour Declaration and the and supporting already Palestinian Arab nationalists. So again, this is a long-held position, and it's very difficult for them to balance these two positions. Now, that being said, they're building also on a past consensus in the Indian public opinion, however you want to define this, or at least the one that has been interested in questions related to the Middle East, that was traditionally exclusively pro-Palestine. And we've had maybe a sort of generational change or change in the political culture that's been more supportive or more empathetic of the Israeli positions of the last, I think, 2 decades, or 3 decades since normalization of ties between the two countries. And the Congress has noticed that. The Congress was the party in power that normalized ties with Israel. It was the party that also, in the 10 years before Modi came to power, accelerated defense ties or developed agricultural ties. So it's not like Congress did also fail. There was an interest, a benefit also in cultivating ties with Israel. Now, these positions, and this kind of evolving fluid position that the Congress had is also because it's, I think, torn between its traditional pro-Palestine position and also the fact that it also should recognize the scale of the attack of Hamas and condemn terrorism. And also because it knows it has developed itself when it was in power, and there's some interest benefit also in developing, cultivating ties with Israel from various reasons, defense, economic, or agricultural cooperation. So I think all of this does come into play and explains the complications of that the Congress has been accused of. Now, the Congress has been edging, but you can argue edging has been a bipartisan kind of thing because, as I mentioned earlier, the BJP has also tilted between supporting Palestine or Israel, or trying to carefully navigate between the two positions. And edging has been a traditional position, I would say, also of India vis-a-vis the broader Middle East.
Just to kind of highlight the social churn a little bit, there have been some analyses that have shown that a significant majority of tweets shared with the hashtags Israel under attack or I stand with Israel actually originated from within India. And I think a lot of people from the outside who saw this and read news stories about this were surprised, because it wasn't obvious to them why ordinary Indians would have such a large stake in the conflict, or necessarily why they would sympathize with the Israeli perspective. In your view, Nicolas, was this a coordinated response? Do you think it was an organic reflection of, again, changing social currents? How do you make sense of why you saw these trends on social media coming from within India?
Well, I must admit, I was also surprised, like many, and I'm a close observer of that relationship between India and Israel, and the scale of this kind of reaction in social media, whether you mentioned Twitter, but also there's been mention of a lot of Facebook, WhatsApp groups that have also commented on what was happening, and also relayed, and especially also given the scale of social media usage in India, obviously relayed to a greater scale some of the messaging coming from Israel, but also developing its own messaging on the situation. There's been a lot of reports from certain media about also, and again, we have to be careful about systematic studies of this, but some fake information also originating from Twitter handles or coming from India. So this is something completely, I think, novel, and because in my observation, in my different studies or interviews in India, there's not that much knowledge about the intricacies of the Israel-Palestine dispute or conflict, or in the history of it. And so this interest was completely novel, and to the wide scale of the reactions. I think for it's not so much about a close interest in the situation per se. I think it's a reflection of internal, I think, issues and internal political issues, and because a lot of the tweets that you mentioned, the Twitter handles that have been identified about relaying some of the Israeli messaging, can be linked to groups or websites that are traditionally supportive of the BJP, Hindutva, RSS, or Hindu nationalism more broadly. I think it's broader than that. It's not just these groups, but a lot of media accounts have been noticing coming from that ecosystem. And it's not clear what's leading to this, but I do think there is some fascination with Israel. Ideological interest that has been very long historical within the BJP about Jewish national project. That's one. About counterterrorism, that there's been a long fascination, I think, by the BJP and its broader support base on the way Israel has been able to deal and fight terrorism, both internal and external security issues. And there's also an argument that's been advanced by a few scholars about interest also in the ethnic democracy model in Israel, and as theorized by Sami Smua, and this close interest in Israeli politics and that side about the institutional evolution and reforms in Israel. I still think it's mostly social media messaging that is for internal consumption. Again, I mentioned elections are coming up. And there's many analogies that have been made with terrorism issues in India and also internal security issues in India. And flawed analogies, mostly, no strong empirical corroboration. Maybe 26/11 is the most relevant analogy of an attack. I saw a lot of tweets referring to Mumbai 26/11 and the operations by Hamas on October 7th. But I think what I've seen in the messaging is this warning that this could happen in India. These kind of operations could happen. It might not be that to the same scale, but the only leaders that could fight this are Modi and the BJP, because there's been a strong messaging that Modi and the BJP have been stronger on counterterrorism than the INC, arguing that there's been no terrorist attacks in 2014. There's been that messaging. We can discuss. I mean, Uri, Pulvama. There's been, but especially the reactions to these attacks, and this also has been mentioned as something that's been emulated or in the same league as Israel's counterterrorism operation or our strategies. So I think this is not trivial. But I think it's mostly about. It's mainly for internal consumption in the run-up, maybe to the elections, trying to argue that this is a warning, and maybe the BJP is the only movement or political actor that could prevent the same kind of atrocities or the same kind of attacks that we've witnessed in Israel. But again, the analogies for me are not so clear. It's purely political messaging.
I mean, what was so interesting is, shortly after the October 7th attacks, the BJP's official Twitter handle did have this montage of terrorist attacks that took place under the previous Congress government's watch. I think that's the one you're referring to, between 2004 2014, with the caption saying that, we stand with Israel, this has happened here too. And of course, it selectively chose all of the attacks which took place in that 10-year period, forgetting about some which took place after 2014. But, just to kind of extend this a little bit further, Nicolas, I mean, it is interesting in another dimension, which is the alleged assassination of a Sikh separatist leader in Canada, Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Many people in India, both in the op-ed pages and on social media, have said, look, there's no evidence that India did it, but if they did do it, well, Israel has been doing this for a long time. And it just shows that the RNAW, India's external intelligence agency, is now on a par with, say, the Israeli Mossad, right? So there does seem to be a bit of security envy, I guess you could say, of what Israel has been able to do from within inside the Indian establishment. Do you sense that as well?
No, I sense that. There's clearly. You mentioned this interesting two-pronged defense of the Kenzie accusations by Prime Minister Trudeau. Is that first we didn't do it? There's no proof, or show us the proof. And if we did it, and maybe that's not the official position, but it is again this sportive social media ecosystem that, and what if we did it? Other countries that have done it, look at Israel. And this is not actually aligns with some of the Indian positions of the last few years, especially under the two Modi terms, especially talking about emulating the Israeli model when it comes to operations in other territories and other extra state operations, notably the post-Uri surgical strikes or the surgical strikes after Pulvama, using, by the way, an Israeli purchased bomb, the Spice 2000 targeted bombs. So again, there's this envy. Modi is even mentioned, I think, following the post-Uri operations in Pakistan, Kashmir, that India was in the same league as the US and Israel. So, and Modi has also mentioned Entebbe as an example of a successful operation. So there's clearly this Israel envy that is not just rank and file. It's also shared by leader the leadership in government of the BJP. You also see references by Amit Shah, the Home Minister, about also the way Israel has been able to deal with these security threats. So there clearly is, it can be dealt with these operations that the possibility to operate abroad to defend security interests at home, but also the kind of intelligence and surveillance systems that India can benefit from Israel, that it's purchased. So it's purchased drones, surveillance drones, weaponized drones. It's purchased, as I said, those spice bombs. It's purchased cross-border sensor systems. And as we know, the Pegasus system and other types of surveillance systems that it says has benefited Israel. This kind of this technology fetish that Israel has developed over the last year, that it can help defend itself internally and externally against these threats. India's, at least the BJP, clearly thinks it can emulate that system against the threats coming from Pakistan and even possibly potentially China. Yeah.
So, Nicola, I think it's probably worth us stepping back for a second and putting this in a larger historical context, right? So, in your book on India's Israel policy, you note very clearly that, look, India has not always been a staunch ally of Israel, right? So, if you go back, say, and look at the 1967, 1973 wars, India supported the Arab side. Things, of course, began to shift in the 1990s. And of course, now we're in this Modi era where you can say there's been a close strategic embrace. Tell me a little bit about the first period, right? So from 1947, Israel becomes an independent nation. So does India. A lot of skepticism actually in India about the Israeli project, and that continues for several decades. Tell us a little bit about the calculations there from the New Delhi's perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I could go on for long because I've written the book in 2015 about the history of the evolution, and most of the chapters are actually pre-1992, when the establishment of diplomatic relations. And actually, the book finishes in 2014 when Modi takes over. I think there's just a couple of paragraphs on Modi's Israel policy. But not to summarize a bit, I think there's a couple of things that are important. First, I don't think people are as much aware about the historical interest that India had into the Palestine question, as it was named at the time, the question about the future of the mandate of Palestine that was British administered and then basically the question was deferred to the UN in its incipient years, and that India actually was looking at the Israel-Palestine issue through its own kind of decolonizing process. I mean, the partitions of India, of British India, and the partition of Israel-Palestine are deeply interlinked. The way the India looks at the potential partition of the mandate of Palestine, it basically mirrors a little bit the questions that were happening within Congress, within the debates happening between Nehru, Gandhi, and Maulana Azad. I mean, these. The Congress could not take a position supporting a partition of the mandate of Palestine on religious terms if it was defending a separate position at home, right? So this actually shaped, I think, India's initial reaction. And India actually volunteered its role into the UN SCOP, which was the initial committee, as you know, that decided and voted on what would become of the mandate of Palestine. And India voted at the time for a federal solution. a federal solution with a majority Arab state, but with constitutionally guaranteed minority religious rights for the Jewish population. Now, that was a minority vote. The majority voted for the partition, so Israel was created as a state, or declared itself as a state soon afterwards. And India, as you mentioned, a couple of years later, despite initially the fact that it didn't support the creation of Israel on the creation of a Jewish national home, recognized Israel, because as Nehru mentioned in a letter to Chief Minister, that basically its existence was a recognized international fact, right? So India did recognize Israel in 1950, but did not establish diplomatic ties for another 42 years. But another thing that I would mention in talking about these 42 years of non-relation, India did not also have relations with any Palestine entity for many years. India was very circumspect about diplomatic dealings with the different representations that existed of the Palestine cause, because it didn't know if these were actually sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian national cause, or these were actually the basic instruments of other Arab states defending their own interests. So it's not that India did not have relations with Israel, it also did not have relations with any Palestinian political entity until the 70s, when it developed close relations with the Palestine Liberation Organization, with Yasser Arafat, and it became the first non-Arab state to recognize the PLO as the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. So this is an important, I think, context, because people think that India was skewed towards one position, but it was actually much more of a fluid position. Now, as you also mentioned, India's non-relationship policy was very much criticized at various occasions, because India supported Arab states in 67, 73 unconditionally, at the detriment of its own interests, sometimes of its own commercial interest in the regions, because the Suez Canal had to be closed, because it had troops, UN peacekeeping troops in the Sinai that actually ended up being killed during the different offensives in 67. So again, India decided to have this strong pro-Arab position. This was not reciprocated in the different conflicts of Pakistan. The Arab states and Muslim states mainly aligned with Pakistan, and even during the 1962 conflict with China, there was not a clear support, I think, by the Arab states in favor of India. And then, in the meanwhile, Israel unconditionally supported India on every occasion. So this was strongly criticized, and I think I mentioned this in the book. There's this interesting coalitions. It's not a organized political coalition, but there's this coalition of interest. The Bharatiya Janata Sangh, so the predecessor to what would become the BJP, the Swatantra Party, and the Praja Socialist Party, which all advocate for normalization of ties with Israel and criticizing the Congress Arabs policy, its Middle East policy. So there's always been a debate. It's not been a one-sided issue. And so I think this leads to these regular steps there's been towards normalization by the Janata government in the late 70s, and then by at various times Rajiv Gandhi tried to establish diplomatic relations. And it's only in 1992 that under Narasimha Rao that the ties are established with Israel, while also maintained with, obviously, the support to the PLO. But all of this is facilitated by the Oslo peace process. When India feels that it can't be talking just to the PLO when the PLO is talking to Israel through the Oslo peace process. So there's also some discussions happening with Arafat about preparing normalization of ties. And this is when we get to these early 90s, when India has good relations with both countries, but also starts developing these close economic and especially defense ties with Israel in the 1990s.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So let me ask you about that, right? Because you mentioned that it was really Oslo that paved the way for this shift or reinvention of India's policy. But obviously, there's a lot of stuff going on in the 90s, right? You have the fall of the Soviet Union, you have the Indian era of liberalization, you have an increasing pivot, tilt, whatever you want to call it, towards the West. You also have the fact that Israel continued to do business with India even when other Western countries sanctioned India following the 98 nuclear tests. So, before we get up to the Modi era, tell us a little bit about what were the factors that were really decisive in your mind of bringing Israel and India closer together in this period, say starting from 91, 92 onwards.
Yeah, this is very important. I mean, also peace process is one of the factors, and I think it's also a rationalization. I think of the Rao government at the time. Rao basically brings up the fact to Arafat, apparently in a very famous early January 1992 meeting, just before the normalization happens. Well, he brings up the fact you're talking to Israel. We need we should be also there, maybe in these peace conferences that are happening in Madrid, in Russia, and Moscow. So maybe we should also be part of this process. Maybe we should start normalizing diplomatic relations. And Arafat gives its political kind of he vouches for this normalization in a public statement. So again, this happens, but there's also, as you say, the liberal economic liberalization that is forced a bit on India because of the balance of payment crisis, and also India needs to develop closer relation with the U.S. and with some of the main Bretton Woods institutions, etc. So it needs to normalize its relation with Israel because it needs to support the U.S. And the U.S. has often placed a condition on India, especially in the 1980s, when you have the Anti-Defamation League criticizing India's policy towards Israel, that India needs to develop ties with Israel. And this is something Rajiv Gandhi, as I mentioned, had noticed when he was himself talking to the U.S. and trying to negotiate with the U.S. On improving economic ties. That Israel came up a few times in his discussion, especially with people from senators and congressmen. So again, this regularly came up. So bilateral relations with the U.S. were conditional also on improved relation with Israel. And finally, you mentioned the USSR dissolution. Overnight, India loses can't rely completely on its traditional weapons supplier, 70% of its equipment. So it needs to find both new weapons. New weapon sources, where you can get equipment relatively cheap, as the USSR used to be able to offer it, and also ways to upgrade and to find spare parts of Soviet Russian equipment. And in these two things, Israel was a reliable partner. It could provide some degree of defense equipment at a cheap and fast, and it had developed a good experience also in upgrading and or maintaining Soviet equipment by its own. The fact that there was a Russian immigration to Israel, and had also captured a few Soviet equipments during its different wars with the Arab states. So this is something that helped. And what you mentioned is 1998, the nuclear test, 1999, the war of Cargill. Israel is one of the rare countries which does not discontinue weapons procurement, does not provide weapons, and also does not provide spare parts and ammunition provides a weapons and spare parts, ammunition and spare parts to India. So it's one of the rare countries, and this is it helps its impression to be a reliable supplier in dire times, basically. This left an impression on the BJP, which was in power at the time, and also in Congress. I think Congress also regularly mentions this after he comes back to power in 2004, that Israel was there when the U.S., the Russia were not able to provide equipment to India in its different conflicts, and its 1999 conflict with Pakistan.
I think you've used this phrase elsewhere that, Modi has brought India-Israel relations out of the closet, as it were, which again paints a stark contrast with the approach favored by previous governments, which had moved closer to Israel, but were somewhat reluctant to publicly embrace the country, right? You pointed out in your recent piece with Shumat that even the previous BJP government under Vajpayee was somewhat tentative about how open they wanted to be. Clearly, we're in a different era now. What do you think is different, say, post 2014?
Yes, that's a good question. I mean, I think a couple of factors are different, obviously. Contrary to the Vajpayee government, or even to the previous Congress governments that have been in power in the 90s and early 2000s, is Modi's personal. Modi is with a government. His government is basically a one-party majority. So this gives him kind of this political leverage. So it facilitates a more public engagement. He doesn't have a coalition, or his coalition, he's less beholden to the coalition and to different foreign policy or domestic constituency interest, and notably to potential domestic Muslim population. If you believe that there is such a thing as a Muslim vote when it comes to relations with Israel, so this clearly gives kind of a freer hand to Modi in India at the time. There's also Modi's personal history with Israel, which as I mentioned, Modi has traveled as a chief minister to India, to Israel, sorry, and that happens in 2006. This is only 4 years after Godra, when Modi is not such a welcome politician in many parts of the world. Uh, and he has promoted better trade and agricultural ties between Gujarat and Israel. So again, to the point that when he becomes prime minister, the Israeli media labels him as one of the best friends, one of the best Indian friends to Israel. So there was this expectation that he would change also the relationship. So the one part, yeah, I think one other thing that happens, Modi comes in, and despite all the expectations because of his history of Israel that he's going to improve or publicize the ties, he only travels to Tel Aviv in 2017. So that's 4 years after coming into power. Before that, he travels to Dubai, he travels to Riyadh, he travels to Tehran. So I think there's also a cultivation of ties with key Arab stakeholders or Arab state stakeholders in the region before making the jump to publicly embrace Israel and to going to Tel Aviv. So I think this is also very carefully managed by the Modi government, and also to some degree maybe also coming from his national security advisor and the MEA carefully preparing this. Because I think his personal predisposition would have been to travel to Israel earlier, but there's all these other interests in the region, notably better economic ties with the GCCs, etc. And finally, one thing that we should mention is when he comes to power, this 22 years of normalized ties, notably reinforced under different Congress governments, which were the most pro-Palestine advocates. So again, this made the public embrace, I think, easier than under Vajpayee's term. But Vajpayee, to also add, welcomed Ariel Sharon in 2003. He has not been able to travel to Israel, but he still had also more openly engaged Israel than Congress governments. But this was easier, I think, for Modi, given the history, the 25 years history of normalized ties with Israel.
So you've raised a critical point I wanted to ask you about, right? Which is that at the same time India has built these new bridges with Israel, it's also expanded and deepened ties with many Gulf states, the so-called GCC countries. We had a situation a few years ago when a BJP spokesperson made inflammatory comments about the Prophet Muhammad. It appeared that under pressure from Gulf Arab states, is what led to the BJP to actually deal with this spokesperson who made those inflammatory comments. How do you think about the new India Gulf axis, right? Because I think a very superficial reading would say, well, look, Modi doesn't require a quote unquote Muslim vote bank. Therefore, he doesn't have to make the kind of outreach that, say, a Congress government would or a coalition government would to these countries. So what's in it for him? What's in it for India?
I mean, this is an important point, I think, because this happens simultaneously to the public embrace of Israel. So people have kind of forgotten or only emphasized the Israel part, but because of the ideological affinities and personal predisposition of Modi, I think, with Israel. But this isn't actually quite an achievement. And I think when you look at all the scorecards that have been made in 2019 in the run-up to the elections on foreign policy scorecard for Modi, one of the big things that mentioned is outreach to the Gulf states, because that's not initially what as you mentioned, it's not traditionally an Indo-nationalist party that you would expect would make that step. But Modi is the only prime minister that has traveled to almost all GCC capitals. He's traveled 4 times to the UAE. So this is something that came out as a big of a surprise after following his early 2015 visit to Dubai. And they're both more long term, I think, and immediate determinants at play. The long term issues most people notice, right? It's the long energy ties. India has been since the 70s buying a lot of oil and gas from the GCCs, from Iraq, from that region, basically, and Iran. So there's these old ties from then. There's also the major important diaspora in the GCCs, right? When we're talking about 7 to 9 million Indians based in the Middle East, most of them are based in the GCCs, and some GCCs there are actually more. There's more Indians NRIs there than they are inhabitants of the local population, right? So this is quite important. It does create these social ties and these economic ties because there's a lot of the remittances coming back to India are coming from labor workers in the GCC, and disproportionately also impacting the economies of some states like Kerala. So these are old as Dr. Sheshankar mentioned. A lot of the relations with the GCC were actually happening because of people-to relations and not basically designed, not a political design by the governments. And this is something that I think the Modi government picked up on. Of the last decade, building on these social ties, building on these energy ties that already existed, there was also a push for a more, I think, a greater outreach, and building also, I would say, on early Manmohan Singh government's outreach to GCCs, but not to the same scale at what happened under the Modi governments. And so this was, in a way, noticing that India was also noticed differently by the GCCs because of its rising economic profile, because of its infrastructure, because of its some of its technological achievements. There was also an interest in the GCCs of better cultivating economic ties with India. So, building on all this, India increased its commercial ties with these countries to the point now that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the UAE are two of the top three commercial partners of India. Something many people don't know, but it's actually quite substantive. So building on this, the government has organized an outreach policy to further develop these trade ties, to attract foreign direct investments from the UAE and the Saudi Arabia's foreign sovereign funds, a lot in India's infrastructure. There's been major investments or announcements of investments from the two countries over the last few years, and also to develop better strategic and defense ties. This started with more common kind of easily identifiable security interests like anti-piracy, makes sense in the Arabic Sea, but also counterterrorism cooperation. This is something that the Modi government has been good at trying to develop. It's better. There's been always concerns about Indian terrorists being based in safe havens in the UAE or it's in Saudi Arabia. There's been extradition, treaties or arrangements between some of the GCCs in India. There's been more cooperation on this and better sharing of information about terrorist groups operating across the GCCs, India and Pakistan. Because one of the other objectives that India has been trying to push is to decouple or to break or dilute this traditional support that the GCCs are towards Pakistan on Kashmir, on different bilateral crises between the two countries with some success. Because on the different crises, Uri, Pulwama, the GCCs have been neutral or even to some degree have tilted towards India's position. Because it makes sense. There's strategic sense to work with India. There's more money to be made. There's more commercial ties, and there's a lot of interesting investments for these sovereign funds. And to some degree, strategic ties also have maybe more potential than those with Pakistan. So this has been quite a successful, I think, overture to these countries over the last few years. And so I think this can be given to we can give credit to the Modi government for doing this from 2015 onwards.
Nicolas, just to pivot back to Israel for a second, I just want to pick up on something that you said earlier, which is, and you wrote about this in a recent paper, which we'll share in the show notes. India is now the largest export market for Israeli defense products, right? It's a valued partner as well for the joint production development of defense systems. You mentioned how the Israeli support for India during the time of Cargill was something that has been etched into many people's memories. As India seeks to diversify from its reliance on Russian-made defense hardware, where does Israel fit into India's overall defense picture?
I mean, as I mentioned earlier, it's very important. Israel became a quick interest for India in the context of the dissolution of the USSR and concerns about prolonged strategic engagement with Russia's military defense industry, right? Because of the concerns about still getting spare parts and also improving upgrading some of the Soviet equipment. And this is where Israel has become quite an interesting partner, being able to provide these spare parts or helping with the upgrade or the providing high technology that could be complement the existing and aging Soviet Russian equipment. As I mentioned, you mentioned Israel has been considered early on as a reliable military supplier since Cargill. And one thing that it complements also Russia and other relations with other suppliers like the US or France or the UK, it's basically the fact that the provision of high technology defense items, which India could not get from the US, would not get from Western European states because of existing embargoes, because of certain regimes about sharing of certain technology, etc., and even from the traditional Russian supplier, which had been less demanding when it comes to this sharing of technology, but like missile defense systems, early airborne warning systems for AWACS or weaponized drones. These are things that Israel was ready to supply early on, unlike a lot of the other traditional military suppliers. Um, and also joint production. I think this is one thing that Israel has been really early on ready to do and to work with India. There's some of the Israeli defense industry, so AI, Rafael systems, have been ready to work with the DRDO and to work on missile defense systems, the Barak joint missile defense systems, or artillery guns together. This is something that you haven't seen the US and France or Germany or the UK ready to do until recently. Now the US and France have been signaling that they're ready to work on some sharing of technology, some joint production, but this is only a recent step. And I would argue, actually, maybe a reaction to the fact that Israel was ready to provide this supplier. So India has never been like Russia, US, or even France, competing on big defense item tenders, fighter jets, etc. But it's been able to provide this kind of complementary technology, which provides kind of qualitative edge to India vis-a-vis Pakistan or China. And this has been able to for Israel to be still in the top three military suppliers for India after Russia, U.S. or France, depending on which year you look at the CPRI data. But now, similar to Russia, one caveat is Russia is not able to provide some systems or spare parts these days because of its war in Ukraine. You could argue there could be questions over access to systems and spare parts, giving Israel's now defense priorities in the Gaza Strip, etc. So, or potentially if it escalates to a wider regional conflict. So again, this is also something that India will have to closely monitor.
So, Nicola, let me just kind of bring this to an end by asking you a little bit about the future, which is an area that political scientists fear to tread. But let me kind of put it to you this way. We saw last Friday India abstain from voting on a UN General Assembly resolution that explicitly called for an immediate, durable, sustained humanitarian truce between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And that was interesting because I believe this is the case, that India was the only South Asian country that didn't support the resolution. You had, on the other hand, the United States and I think just 13 others that voted against the resolution. Again, India abstained. In your mind, as you look ahead, what are the factors that will determine if India can continue to thread this needle, right? It has an important set of relationships it wants to maintain and build on with Gulf Arab countries. At the same time, it has a budding defense, high technology partnership with Israel. How do you see this playing out? What are the things we should be looking out for?
I mean, the vote on Friday for me was not so surprising. This is part of what I would call a more subtle, tilted edging strategy, where India has been not unlike maybe previous governments, whether it's INC or previous BJP governments, has been systematically pro-Palestine in a lot of the UNGA votes. Now it's moved towards being systematically voting pro-Palestine to more edging between support for Palestine on some votes, abstention on some votes, which seem to be condemning too explicitly Israel, or maybe now The caveat will be not condemning Hamas, because Hamas is clearly a security concern for India, or analogy that can be coming up when India is facing similar external, or what it's perceived to be similar external security threats, terrorist threats, and it wants to be some kind of reciprocation. So I think will be maybe qualifying or explaining the case-by-case basis, I think, on U.S. votes. So we are not our Indian votes at the UNGA or on another multilateral settings, because this has been happening since 2014 and Modi coming to power. There's been some votes where India was perceived to be tilting towards Israel because it didn't vote similarly to previous years. But this is what the BJP has been arguing. It's more a case-by-case basis kind of evaluation of the voting, the actual merits of the vote. And I think this is what we're going to see a bit more. The new terrorism mention, condemning explicitly terrorism, I think will be something that will be coming further in those debates. Because India has been actually, mind you, it's actually a couple of years ago, it voted against a US-sponsored resolution condemning Hamas. So it's under Modi government, it's abstained on this kind of vote. So I think it's going to be a new position, but it's going to be what you mentioned about also carefully balancing with its other Arab partners in the region. India has to be careful with its relation with the GCCs. There's a lot of economic interests, as I mentioned, major commercial ties, major connectivity projects. We could mention I2U2, the EMEC, that was announced at the G20. So India has been also carefully follow what the UAE, Saudi Arabia, which were normalizing at the time of their ties with Israel, and this could all be coming back into question with the recent crisis. So India has to carefully manage this and see that it has not to be perceived as tilting too much towards Israel if these countries also are carefully balancing or then taking a position. One example of this becoming problematic is Oman just announcing that it will not allow its airspace to be used by Israeli air flights. So this creates questions about India could have been able to open air routes to a very fast one to Tel Aviv over the last few years because of Saudi and the Omani authorities permitting Air India flights to go directly to Tel Aviv. If this becomes disrupted, there's many more of these broader kind of normalization in the post-Abraham Accords that India was welcoming that could also go back to a carefully edging strategy, whereas India had been basically one of the biggest benefiters, or benefited the most, I think, from the context of the last few years where Israel had normalized its ties with the Arab states. So this could also all come into question in the coming months.
My guest on the show this week is the political scientist Nicolas Blarel. He is an associate professor of international relations at the Institute of Political Science at Leiden University in the Netherlands. He's also the author of The Evolution of India's Israel Policy, Continuity, Change, and Compromise since 1922. Nicolas, you are going to embarrass all new fathers the world over because you have managed on very little sleep to be amazingly coherent and very thoughtful about what is a very interesting but also very complicated set of relationships in the Middle East that has changed a lot in recent years. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Thank you, Milan, and thank you, everybody.
Grant Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer, and Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.